big piece of what we're doing is trying to dig into some transformative justice principles around accountability, boundaries, feedback, and conflict, and try to understand how Dharma principles and meditation practices and these practices that we're learning in other parts of our life can fit together and be of support for each other. So this is part of what I'll be reflecting on here. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about boundaries tonight, because when we did a little survey to check in about why people were taking the course, that was a hot topic. So I don't know if anyone here has anything they are curious about around boundaries, but I know it's something I definitely feel like I'm always learning around, and always have a lot of conditioning to do boundaries poorly. So thought I'd think a little bit about that with you all here tonight. So boundaries is this psychology term, and for me, it can sometimes feel a little bit at odds with Buddhist teachings on interdependence, which is part of why I wanted to ground us in a mindfulness practice that really positioned us in feelings of interdependence and relationship, so that when we're thinking about boundaries, it doesn't sort of heighten what I really can fall into, which is this individualist sense of isolation and trying to do it all myself, but trying to move beyond that towards something that's really about working towards interdependence. So I feel curious what we can learn about when we're trying to think about boundaries and trying to hold our sense of interdependence as part of that, rather than trying to move towards isolation and independence. Like in the practice that I just offered, it's actually hard to find clear lines that separate us from the rest of the world. It's hard to actually draw boundaries when we try to find, like, where does when we're breathing in, where is the air separate from ourselves when we breathe in? So what does it actually mean to try to set boundaries for ourselves? Is that in alignment with nature, or is that something that actually feels like a false dichotomy? So I actually really appreciate this definition from Prentice Hemphill that some of you may have heard before, that I feel like points to something that I want to build into. And Prentice says, boundaries are the distance at which I could love you and me simultaneously. And so it's less about creating separation and more about finding the space that we all need to get our needs met and be loved and love each other. So for me, a big piece of boundary work, like a step one, or even like step 0 before I even can talk about boundaries, is that I have to start working on getting in touch with my own needs. And a lot of my childhood conditioning has encouraged me to just be completely out of touch with my experience of needs, or just to not have needs at all. So my conditioning is I should just ignore that I'm hungry so I can stay thin. Or I should ignore my tiredness so I can keep plowing through my to-do list at work. I should ignore my anger and disappointment so I can keep things appearing peaceful in my family. And I think this is a place where mindfulness practices have been really helpful for me to get back in touch with what needs can feel like in my own body. Like what does hunger feel like? What does anger feel like? What does tired feel like? So I might just invite people to take a couple breaths here as we talk about needs. Is there any physical sensation that you're noticing in your own body? Is there a dry tongue that could use that extra sip of water? Is there a restlessness in your heart? Heard me talking about conflict and you're thinking about a conflict that could use a little more attention. I see a blanket coming out, perhaps to adjust temperature or just feel a little more held. Just taking a moment to notice that connection between what you're sensing and what you need. And if it's something that you can meet in this moment, actually getting that sip of water, or maybe making a small note about what you're noticing so that you can follow up on it later, I really invite you to do that small thing to meet your need. Not just notice it, but actually see if it's possible to take a step towards meeting it. I see a hand on a heart. Yeah, if you're like me, I feel like I'm so conditioned to put my needs aside. There's something that's just really important about this simple practice of scanning for my needs and just taking that small step, or even that small intention towards a step towards meeting them. And I really appreciated the work that happens in disability community that some of you may have been a part of. This invitation to state your access needs at the beginning of a meeting. For me, that's really been an invitation to scan my needs. Like, what is it that I need to show up in this space? Is that need met? Is there something that I can do or this community can do to do a better job of helping me show up or helping each other show up? And I feel like it's like a big part of helping folks be able to even start to work with showing up better with our own boundaries. So starting to get a sense of what we need. And then step one, that next step, once I have a sense of what I might need, boundaries is the work that I need to do in a relationship when I have a need that feels really different than the other person or the group. And I had to set some pretty hard boundaries a few years ago when my parents' marriage ended a month after their 40th anniversary. It was a pretty hard time in my family. And one of the things that happened unexpectedly is that my relationship with my mom unexpectedly broke in the divorce too. It was really sad. And part of what happened is that my mom had 40 years of rage and grief at my dad that was pent up. And that was all she wanted to talk about. And I realized that I didn't actually have the capacity to be my mom's divorce therapist. And if I wanted to hold that boundary and say, I actually cannot be your therapist on that, while at the same time it was all that she could talk about, I actually just had to stop talking to her. And it felt really heartbreaking to not be able to be present and support her when she was having a really hard time. But it was also like really harming me to be trying to hold her in that process. And so loving myself meant I could not replicate those ancestral wounds where I just would have done whatever she needed, rather than stating my own needs in that process. That was part of what was necessary to come out. So setting that boundary was not easy or skillful. In retrospect, I could have done it in some more skillful ways. As someone, I'm very conditioned to be afraid of anger, especially my own. And so I often wait until the last possible moment to be angry at other people. And so I probably waited for a while before I told her that I didn't want to be her therapist anymore. And so by the time I told her, it was a bit of a a bit of a roar. And so I feel like part of what my therapist invited me into, like needing a bit of a different path on that, is what my therapist called a mandala of protection. And I invite you to think about this with me if you'd like to dream up your own version of this as you hear about mine. So part of what this is kind of imagining yourself in the middle of a lot of circles and just picturing, just seeing what arises. What in this world would protect you from intentional or unintentional harm? Like what protects you from people just coming at you? And for me, my first image of this when I did this exercise was sunflowers. And I was like, huh? Why sunflowers? But what I pictured was this very tight, majestic circle of how sunflowers could be planted in a way that a person would have to like muscle their way through the line of sunflowers. And it could be a very tall, majestic, circled boundary. And if there's someone who was willing to listen to that boundary of sunflowers, they could just like frolic in this field and enjoy the sunflowers and just have this like beautiful space to hang out in. And I was like, well, that sounds lovely. I'm glad to give them that space to start in. And then what came next was if someone like shouldered their way past the sunflowers, which, like it happens, like I've certainly done that when I'm like anxious or needy and just like, I need to get closer to you. The next thing that I pictured was this thing I had in my front yard was this prickly purple thistle that has thorns on every part of the flower and the stem. And it's very pretty, but it really, every part of it you touch is like, ouch, it really hurts. So if you try to get your way through the sunflower, it's pretty, but it hurts. So if you're paying attention, you'll notice. And, for anyone who's just pushing hard, if someone pushes through the thistle, they're going to find this next circle. For me, was a wide and deep river. And they'd have to choose to swim. They'd have to choose to get across this in some way. And then it started to get a little meaner. If they dared to wade in the water, there's this line of stone gargoyles that comes alive, and their red beady eyes get a little, they lighten up. And the closest one speaks in this like deep voice. It is time to turn around now. So it starts to get a little more menacing if you get that close to me without consent. And at that point, it's like whoever keeps coming, whether they're confused or intentionally being mean, it feels like they've made some choices. And so then it feels like I don't have to be as ashamed when my anger comes out. And it's more possible for this dragon roar, this like part of who I am, to just be like clear and loving of protecting myself, and just be able to be like, okay, it is time. It is time to back up. And send people back to the sunflowers. And as I was thinking about this, like, even though there's like circles here, if none of these boundaries feel like impenetrable walls, you know, like I said, there's space to picnic in the field next to the sunflowers. There's consent to come closer. If we're in negotiation about that, and the mandalas can part ways. But part of what has been helpful for me in being able to picture that is that it feels like there's more layers for me to have more of a voice to say yes and no about how I'm in relationship with people, and sort of not wait until things are so close that I need to come out with my claws, and be able to identify much earlier when things that start to feel crossed. So I invite you into that mandala of protection imagery, finding your own that makes sense for you, if that feels suited for you.